June 6, 1944. Before the sun rose over Normandy, thousands of men waited in landing craft, engines idling, weapons checked again and again in the dark. For weeks, Allied planners had studied every beach. Some sectors were marked difficult, others were marked dangerous. But one sector sat in a strange category of its own, the Canadian landing zone. It was narrow, exposed, lined with overlapping German defenses built to stop movement before it even began. Concrete bunkers faced the water. Artillery positions were pre-registered. Every approach had been measured and tested by the enemy. On paper, this was not a place for speed. Timetables allowed for confusion. They allowed for delays. They allowed for slow, careful progress measured in hours. At Supreme Headquarters, Dwight D. Eisenhower studied the maps while the invasion unfolded. He knew that the first reports would be messy. Fragments of information, incomplete signals, unclear outcomes. What mattered most in these early moments was control. If the beaches held, the invasion lived. If they didn't, everything else stopped. The expectation was simple: secure the shoreline, stabilize the situation, then push inland when resistance weakened. No one expected momentum, not yet. As the first radio messages began to arrive from Normandy, Eisenhower's staff logged them carefully. British sectors were fighting hard. Other Allied units were still sorting themselves out under fire. Then a message came in from the Canadian sector: landing successful, units intact, movement continuing. It sounded ordinary until the follow-up arrived. Canadian troops weren't just holding the beach, they were pushing beyond it. Officers in the room exchanged looks. Someone asked for clarification. Another officer checked the time since landing. It hadn't been long, not nearly long enough for what the report suggested. Eisenhower leaned over the map, eyes fixed on the Canadian markings as staff prepared to request confirmation. Because if the message was accurate, something unexpected was already happening, and the day was beginning to shift. Inside the headquarters, the room stayed quiet longer than usual. A junior officer stood near the radio table, holding a message sheet he had already read twice. The numbers didn't make sense. The timing didn't line up with any projection prepared before the invasion. "Repeat the report," someone finally said. The radio crackled again. Canadian units had not only secured the beach, they had pushed through the first defensive belt. Key strongpoints were silent. Movement inland was continuing. Fast. Someone checked the clock on the wall. It hadn't even been an hour. At the center of the room, Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped closer to the map. He didn't look at the officer. He looked at the Canadian sector markings. They were already past the line where resistance was supposed to slow everything down. Staff officers began talking at once. Was the report exaggerated? Was it limited to a small unit? Had the enemy pulled back? Eisenhower raised a hand. "Confirm it," he said calmly. Minutes passed. Phones rang. Messages moved across desks. The room filled with low voices and hurried steps. Then the confirmation arrived. The breakthrough was real. Canadian troops were advancing faster than any other Allied sector. German defenses in that area were reacting instead of controlling. Reserves were already shifting to respond. Eisenhower straightened, eyes still on the map. "Then don't interrupt them," he said. The order was simple: supplies forward, routes clear, no delays. The invasion timeline, built over months, was already bending, and the day was still young. The room should have erupted in celebration. Maps showed progress no planner had dared to predict. The Canadian line was already pushing inland, stretching beyond the original objectives for the first hours of the invasion. But Dwight D. Eisenhower didn't smile. He stood quietly at the map, studying the thin blue markings that now cut deeper into Normandy than anyone expected. To most men in the room, it looked like success. To Eisenhower, it looked like responsibility. "Speed creates opportunity," he said finally, breaking the silence. but it also creates exposure. The staff listened closely. A rapid breakthrough meant German commanders would panic. Units would be rushed forward without coordination. Counterattacks would come, not tomorrow, but soon. Eisenhower turned from the map. "They'll try to seal that gap," he said, "hard and fast." An officer suggested slowing the Canadians, allowing adjacent sectors time to catch up. Eisenhower shook his head. "No," he replied, "momentum is doing our job for us." He gave his instructions carefully, deliberately. Keep supply lines open. Clear roads immediately. Redirect air cover if needed. No hesitation. Then he added something that stayed with the staff long after the war. When a door opens in war, you don't stop to admire it. You walk through before it closes. The message was clear. The Canadians weren't ahead of schedule anymore. They were setting the pace for everyone else. By midday, the consequences of those first 40 minutes were impossible to ignore. German reports began arriving through intercepted channels and delayed intelligence updates. They weren't coordinated. They contradicted each other. Some units reported breakthroughs. Others claimed nothing unusual was happening. That confusion mattered. Because while German commanders tried to understand what was unfolding, Canadian forces were already beyond the point where quick fixes worked. Roads once meant for controlled withdrawals were now being used under pressure. Units that were supposed to reinforce other sectors were suddenly being pulled toward the Canadian advance. Inside Allied headquarters, the picture grew clearer by the hour. The enemy wasn't executing a plan anymore. They were reacting. Dwight D. Eisenhower watched the updates arrive without comment. He didn't need dramatic confirmation. The pattern was obvious to him. A fast breakthrough had done something more powerful than destroying positions. It had broken timing. German commanders were now forced to decide too quickly, move too early, or arrive too late. Each rushed decision created another opening somewhere else. An intelligence officer pointed out something unusual. Resistance in nearby sectors was already thinning. Eisenhower nodded once. "That's the cost of surprise," he said. "It spreads." The Canadians hadn't just moved inland. They had pulled the enemy's attention out of alignment. And once timing is lost in war, it's rarely recovered. By the end of the day, Allied planners realized something quietly remarkable. Those first 40 minutes didn't just change one beach. They reshaped the entire rhythm of the invasion. Late that evening, the headquarters finally grew quieter. Reports slowed. Maps stopped changing every few minutes. The invasion was still far from over, but the direction of the day was no longer in doubt. The Canadians had done more than advance. They had set the tempo. Standing by the map one last time, Dwight D. Eisenhower spoke to his senior staff in a low, steady voice. "They didn't give the enemy time to think." He paused, then added, "That's how you win the first day of a war." No speeches followed. No celebration. Just quiet understanding. Those 40 minutes didn't make headlines that morning, but they forced the enemy to spend the rest of the day chasing events instead of shaping them. And in Normandy, that was enough.